Hi everyone. Please remember to leave a comment stating your location and the time you're watching, as well as to like and subscribe to the channel before we begin. In this manner, YouTube will continue to display tales similar to this one. Let's get started now. When snow falls at night, it makes a sound, a gentle murmur that most people undoubtedly find calming. That whisper sounds more like a countdown when you're sleeping beneath a bridge or behind a skip. Each flake that touches your sweeping bag adds a modest weight to the bag. Your body was robbed of another degree. The time when you might not wake up is getting closer by the minute. The first significant storm to strike Omaha in January of last year coincided with my 34th birthday. I sat staring at a stale cupcake with a crooked candle for a long time after someone at the soup kitchen handed it to me, before I could consume it. Birthdays on the street feel like counterfeit festivities, like having a party on a sinking ship. Not because I wasn't appreciative. Yes, another year passed, but at what price? And for how long? Pete. More than anybody I knew, Garrison could relate to that emotion. 2 winters before, we had met at a warming center next to the former railroad depot. Our teeth chattered together like a broken percussion instrument as we both shivered so hard. Pete had a dirty gray beard and appeared to be around 55 years old. He had watery blue eyes that looked to be always looking for something he had lost and would never find again, and his mouth was yellow from years of smoking cigarettes. He once told me that he had been a plumber for 23 years, owned a small home with a paid-off mortgage, and had a wife named Ruth who made the best chicken pie in Nebraska. 6 months later, Pete was sitting in an empty house that felt like a cemetery after Ruth was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He was consumed by grief. He stopped paying his expenses, quit going to work, and stopped giving a damn if he lived or died. He claimed that by the time he ended himself on the streets, he felt almost relieved, as if he had finally given up pretending that life without Ruth was worth fighting for. It had been a harsh January from the begin. However, even the veterans were anxious about the weather forecast for that specific Wednesday. With wind chills bringing the temperature closer to -30, it was predicted to plummet to -15. I recall thinking about how thin the boundary between their world and mine is, as I stood outside the library on a Monday afternoon, watching folks hurry by in their heated car seats and thick jackets. It only takes one poor month, one medical bill, and one layoff. The shelters had already announced that they would be overcrowded, and that individuals would be turned away by lottery, akin to a bizarre game show where the losers may freeze to death. That afternoon, Pete and I discussed our alternatives, while perched on milk crates behind the Vietnamese grocery shop, where the proprietor occasionally allowed us to get warm close to the back vent. Pete never showed up that evening, despite our decision to stay together and find a place in the Farnham Street underground parking garage, where the concrete retained some heat from the passing cars. I stomped my feet and blew into my palms, while I waited for him till almost 9 o'clock, watching as my breath crystallized and vanished into the night. Checking the recycling bins close to the campus was something he had recommended. One of his few remaining pleasures was cigarettes, which he purchased by gathering cans and bottles, and I reasoned that perhaps he had moved to a better location or into one of the church basements, which occasionally opened during emergencies. Pete had weathered harder winters than this, and he knew the methods better than most. So I persuaded myself not to worry. I curled up by myself in the parking garage's corner, covered myself with all of my clothing, and attempted to fall asleep as the wind howled outside like a ravenous beast. My aspirations were. It was disjointed and weird, full of pictures of Ruth standing in a kitchen I had never seen before, calling Pete to a white-lit door. I was shivering violently when I woke up at 4 in the morning, and I immediately realized that something wasn't right. Around 7:30, the sun rose, looking distant and pale, as if it was ashamed to reveal its face after the events of the previous night. I began to walk in the direction of the university, following Pete's regular path when he went collecting. After a hard freeze, the streets became eerily quiet. There were no runners or dog walkers, only the occasional automobile that crept by with its windows still covered in frost. Every breath felt like I was breathing in shattered glass as my boots crunched against the salted sidewalks. I looked in the usual places. On weekends, the recycle bins filled up the lane behind the student union. Warm air occasionally escaped from the ventilation system near the scientific building's loading dock system. Pete enjoyed sitting on the bus stop shelter on Dodge Street and watching the college students pass by. Nothing. He was nowhere to be found. A caretaker emerging from one of the dorms gave me the usual expression of sympathy and disgust. And I knew how it would go. I wanted to grab him by his spotless uniform and ask whether he had seen an elderly man with a yellow beard. About 6 blocks from where I had been looking, on Leavenworth Street, I discovered Pete in the small alley between a pawn store and a laundromat. He was sitting with his legs up against the brick wall, extended out in front of him with his hands on his thighs, as if he had just made the decision to stop and collect his breath. His eyes were open, staring directly at the skip across from him, and for a terrible moment, I believed he was still alive. And he had a nearly serene expression on his face, as if he had at last discovered the solution to a problem that had plagued him for years. However, when I drew nearer, I noticed the frost on his eyelashes, the blue hue surrounding his lips, and the waxy feel of his skin that no real person ever had. I called his name once, twice, and 3 times, becoming louder each time. However, my voice simply vanished into the icy air after bouncing off the walls. Pete had vanished. He had been absent for hours, most likely since before midnight, when the temperature had reached its lowest point, and his body had just given in to the cold. For what seemed like a lifetime, I sat down next to him on that frozen concrete, no longer concerned with maintaining my own body heat. His shopping cart was parked a little distance away, still filled with the plastic bags of cans and bottles he had gathered, possibly worth $8 if he was lucky, in order to pay for a pack of cigarettes and possibly a cup of coffee at the petrol station. He had spent his final hours on Earth going through rubbish. I saw that his gloves were gone, most likely lost. Were taken a few weeks prior, and his bare wrists were curled inward like claws. The nails had become nearly black in color. When I reached over and touched his shoulder, it felt like I was touching a statue, completely immobile and unrelated to any kind of human warmth. A noise emerged from my friend. I leaned my forehead into his arm and allowed the grief to rip through me like a winter wind, discovering every crack in a shattered window. It was a mouth that I did not recognize, something between a moan and a scream. After a while, a woman passed the alley entrance, most likely en route to her job at one of the street's stores. After taking a quick look inside and doing a double take, she took out her phone and dialed 911. She described what she observed in a high-pitched, terrified voice. "Please send someone right away. There are 2 homeless men, one of whom may be dead. She did not approach me, did not inquire about my well-being, and did not provide any consolation. She simply stood at the alley's entrance with her phone glued to her ear, observing us as if we were animals in a zoo show that had suddenly turned unsettling rather than amusing. About 15 minutes after the paramedics arrived, a police cruiser carrying 2 bored-looking officers pulled up. I was asked if I knew the dead by one of them, and the term deceased nearly made me giggle, as if Pete were merely a statistic to be noted and a file to be processed. A problem that had conveniently resolved itself by passing away in a secret alleyway. Pete was zipped into a black body bag and put him in a van with no windows at all. When I asked one of the paramedics where they would take him, she informed me that he would stay at the county mortuary until they could find his next of kin, or, in the event that they couldn't, make arrangements for a pauper's burial in the municipal cemetery. I considered Pete's daughter, whom he had only brought up once in my whole acquaintance with him. After receiving too many frantic calls for money, she changed her phone number years ago and lived someplace in California. He never held her accountable for cutting him off. He acknowledged that witnessing a loved one ruin themselves is a form of pain in and of itself. Walking away before the drowning man pulls you down with him is sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do. However, he stood there and watched as his body was driven away in that vehicle. I pondered whether she would ever get the news if a bureaucrat found her and called her like it was an unpaid library notice. Your dad has passed away. Behind a laundromat, he froze to death. Do you want to take possession of the body? This is what people don't know about exposure-related deaths. It's not like the spectacular collapses in snowbanks in films. The cruelty of hypothermia is subtle, sneaky, and almost kind. In order to keep your center warm, your body first removes blood from your limbs, sacrificing your fingers and toes, and you experience this intense, painful cold that feels like it's living inside your bones. Then the intense, uncontrollable shaking begins. Your remaining energy is being burned by your muscles in an attempt to produce heat. However, you will know you are in serious trouble when the shivering finally ceases. Your body has conceded defeat and given up the battle. Began turning off systems one at a time, much like a building going dark floor by floor. The most peculiar aspect is that many people start to feel warm towards the conclusion. They begin taking off their clothes because they believe they are overheated due to their confused brains misinterpreting the signals. They refer to it as paradoxical. One method of identifying hypothermia victims is by undressing. At least Pete was spared that last humiliation because he was still fully clothed when I found him. However, as I reflect on those final hours spent by himself in that alley, I wonder whether he screamed out for Ruth because he believed she was coming to get him. The following day, a brief article appeared in the local section of the newspapers, sandwiched between an advertisement for a furniture sale and a report on a school board meeting. The headline said, "Homeless man found dead in downtown alley." They merely identified him as a white man in his 50s, without even printing his name. There was no identification on him. Extreme cold exposure is thought to be the cause of death. That was all. Pete Garrison's obituary was just that. A man who before the world decided he was disposable, had paid taxes, fixed pipes, and loved his wife. According to the article, 3 more homeless people had passed away in the same week throughout the city, bringing the season's total to 11. 11 people frozen to death in a nation that wastes enough food to feed entire countries in a city with abandoned office buildings, heated parking garages, and churches preaching neighborly love on every corner. I saved that clipping from the newspaper. The paper was folded up in my coat pocket for months, until it became soft and began to crumble along the folds. Someone had to remember the precise number 11, and I wanted to. Now that a year has gone by, I'm still waging the same war that Pete lost. I discovered a place in a program for transitional housing last spring. It's a little room with a locked door and a radiator that keeps me warm, despite hissing and clanking like a furious cat. Every day, especially when the temperature decreases and I watch news broadcasts about the establishment of warming centers and donation efforts to gather coats, I think about Pete. The problem is that coats are insufficient. Shelters are insufficient, not when there are more people than beds available. And those who are turned away must risk their lives by flipping a coin. We all need people to stop viewing us as ghosts, just like Pete did. Should cease viewing homelessness as a personal shortcoming rather than a social disaster. Pete did not die as a result of his weakness, laziness, or poor decisions. He died because a civilization that could afford to launch rockets into space was unable to find a way to care for an elderly person in mourning. Man from dying from cold 6 blocks away from a heated mall. I now carry that reality with me, inscribed into my chest like an incurable scar. I also share it with anyone who is open to hearing it. I was friends with Pete Garrison. He deserved so much more than an unmarked person since he had a name, a past, and a soul. Grave on the outskirts of town, in a frozen field. On a wet Wednesday in September, my automobile became my flat. And although it wasn't dramatic or cinematic, I wish I could say that. My flat lease terminated 6 months after I received my communications degree from Ohio State, leaving me with precisely $400. She and my flatmate had relocated to Seattle. Boyfriend. My parents, well, let's just say that returning to their home in Akron was not an option after everything that had transpired, and my temporary work at the insurance business had dried up. My entire existence was stuffed into the back seat of my 2009 Toyota Corolla, and there I was, 24 years old, collecting dust with a degree in journalism. The McDonald's parking lot on Cedar Road in Beechwood was my choice, because it was open late, had good Wi-Fi that could reach the lot, and the fluorescent lights made me feel a little less alone. It would just be for a few weeks, I assured myself, until I found something reliable. I had established a whole routine by the time that was 3 weeks ago. After 11, park in the same corner. Before they lock it, use the loo. Put my pepper spray between the center console and the driver's seat and go to sleep. It was a Thursday in early October, on that specific night, and the temperature had dropped to perhaps 45 degrees. I recall that even though I had 2 hoodies layered underneath my winter coat, I still woke up shivering at 2 in the morning. By then, only my car, an old pickup truck that had been parked close to the drive-thru since before I arrived, and a white van parked well on the opposite end by the dumpsters made up the nearly empty parking lot. I had become accustomed to sleeping light, waking up whenever someone approached my car too closely or headlights passed over my windscreen. However, something was different when I opened my eyes that evening. There was something off about the air in the car. Like a thunderstorm just before it starts, it was heavy and charged. I blinked several times in an attempt to get used to the darkness. That's when I noticed it. Outside my driver's side window was a shape, standing motionless, about 6 inches away from the glass, without moving or passing by. I wanted to scream, but I was unable to do so. It was a male. The silhouette told me that much. Tall, perhaps 6 feet, and dressed in what appeared to be a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up. His face was so near to the window that his breath was creating tiny, rhythmic clouds on the glass. The outline of his nose, his forehead, and the way his hands were cupped around his eyes gave me the impression that he was window shopping or attempting to see inside a store window. That seemed like hours for a few seconds. I lay motionless in my recliner, hoping that he was unable to see me through the moisture that had accumulated within the glass. I was sure he could hear how quickly my heart was beating. I stayed put. I stopped breathing. I simply observed. As my thoughts raced through every possibility that could possibly occur, those tiny clouds of breath repeatedly appeared and vanished on the glass. Then he went to the rear window. I saw his shadow move across my field of vision until he halted directly behind me, and I heard his slow, methodical, and leisurely footfall on the pavement. Everything I owned was crammed into the rear seat. My laptop bag, clothes and trash bags, a tiny cooler, and a blanket and pillow that I used every night. He stared at my belongings for what must have been 2 whole minutes, and I became acutely aware that he was aware of it. He was aware that this car was inhabited. He had likely been observing me for days or even weeks, getting to know my routine and determining my weak points. My chest constricted so much at the concept that I felt like I may faint. I could. Now you can hear his breathing. Or perhaps I was dreaming. In the quiet, every sound seemed magnified. A car door slamming someplace far away, the distant hum of the highway, and beneath it all, the gentle shuffle of his shoes as he walked once again. He returned to the driver's side. He didn't merely glance this time. The door handle was being checked, and I heard it click. It was a light pull at first, then more forceful. The force of it caused the entire car to rock a little. I had my locks down. The sound of someone attempting to enter your room, your only space in the world, sticks with you, even though I always double-checked before going to bed. I could hear him grunt as he tried again, yanking this time. Then his face reappeared at the window, and this time, his features were just barely discernible in the orange glare of the parking lot lights as he got closer. He appeared normal. The worst thing was that, not a crazy, wild-eyed person. Not particularly hazardous. Just an ordinary guy, perhaps in his 40s, with stubble on his chin and a receding hairline. The kind of face you wouldn't look twice at in a grocery store. He grinned at the window, and even though I knew he probably couldn't see me well, it seemed like he was grinning right at me. I'm not sure where the bravery, but something inside of me cracked. Perhaps it was the smile, or perhaps it was the realization that I would remain motionless until he found a way in if I did nothing. I quickly sat up, smashed my palm against the horn, and grabbed the pepper spray from next to my seat. Like a bomb going off, the roar reverberated around the deserted parking lot. The man's expression changed from that composed smile to one of amazement as he staggered back. We merely looked at each other through the glass for a little moment. The sound continued to blast while I kept my hand on the horn. I also raised the pepper spray so he could see it with my other hand. I guess I was yelling too, but I can't recall what I said. Most likely nothing coherent. Just the sound itself. In a single primal outburst, all the dread, rage, and powerlessness of the previous 3 weeks came out of me. Thank God, he raced away from me instead, darting across the parking lot in the direction of the white van beside the dumpsters. Leaning on the horn, I watched him go, my entire body shaking so badly that my teeth were chattering. The van's headlights turned on, and in a matter of seconds, its tires were screaming on the pavement as it sped out of the lot. Just the first 3 characters of the license plate, BKV, were visible to me before it vanished onto Cedar Road that leads east. I didn't remove my hand from the horn until then. The roar was almost overshadowed by the silence that ensued. My throat felt raw, my ears were ringing, and I became aware that I was crying. The horrible kind of tears, not the gentle ones. The kind where you can't breathe, your entire face twisted, and snot trickled down your lip. I sobbed until I was unable to do so while sitting in the driver's seat with pepper spray still clenched in my fist. About 5 minutes later, the McDonald's night manager emerged. Brianna was a heavy-set, black woman in her 50s who wore reading glasses that were pushed up on her forehead. Her expression, which was half displeasure and half worry. She wanted to know what the hell was going on because she had heard the horn from inside. I tried to explain with my trembling breath and hiccups. The door handle, the window, the man and I all saw her countenance change from annoyance to something more gentle, akin to sympathy. I couldn't lie when she asked if I lived in my car. Not just then. All I did was nod. She didn't tell me I couldn't park there anymore, didn't say anything critical, and didn't scold me about making better decisions. She simply told me she was contacting the cops and offered me a cup of steaming coffee through my broken window. I wanted to give her a hug. In addition, I wanted to vanish into the seat cushions and disappear forever. About 20 minutes later, the police showed up. A Beechwood cruiser with 2 cops, an older woman with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, and a younger male with a buzz cut. In the parking lot, they got my statement. While Brianna stood in the doorway, shielding herself from the cold with her arms folded. I told them everything. The man, the hoodie, the partial number plate number, the way his face was crushed against the glass. While the older police officer used a torch to scan my automobile for any indications of tampering. The younger officer recorded everything in a little notebook. Where his face had been, she discovered smudges on the driver's side glass and fingerprints that are oily around the door handle. Throughout, they took pictures. I sensed that they were viewing my car in a different light. Noticing the empty fast food wrappers I hadn't had time to discard, the pillow in the back seat, and the trash bags of clothes. I was aware of their thoughts. I had noticed that expression previously from patrons at rest areas and gas stations. The expression that asks, "How did you end up like this?" without posing the question. I was asked how long I had been sleeping in the parking lot by the elder cop, whose name tag said Sergeant Kimmel. 3 weeks, I informed her. She inquired whether I had any family or friends who could take me in, or if I had someplace else to go. I mainly told the truth when I said no. She refrained from pushing. Rather, she warned me that things could have turned out very differently tonight, and offered me a card for a women's shelter, approximately 15 minutes away. It was merely a matter of fact. She wasn't being harsh. However, her remarks struck me like a blow to the chest. I was aware that she was correct. I couldn't stop thinking about the scenarios that could have happened if my doors hadn't been locked, if I hadn't woken up when I did, and if I hadn't had the pepper spray close at hand. The younger police officer stated that they would issue an alert for the white vehicle, but it was clear from his tone that he didn't think much would come of it. There are no witnesses other than me, The parking lot is dark, and the license plates are incomplete. I got it. I wasn't gullible enough to believe they would apprehend him. Brianna allowed me to use the loo and wash my face after the police had left. It had terrible fluorescent lighting. I hardly recognized myself when I glanced in the mirror. My skin was pale and blotchy. My hair was a knotted mess from sleeping on it incorrectly, and my eyes were swollen and red. I guess it made sense because I looked like someone who had been living in a car for 3 weeks. I attempted to calm myself by splashing cold water on my face, but my hands continued to shake. I saw his face at the window each time I closed my eyes. That regular face with that awful grin. Brianna was anticipating me when I emerged, carrying a bag containing a big fries and 2 cheeseburgers. "On the house," she remarked. She simply rubbed my shoulder and advised me to take care of myself when I started crying again, which was embarrassing. She claimed to have a daughter of mine, and she felt sick to her stomach at the idea of being out there by herself in a parking lot. I simply thanked her and returned to my car because I had no idea how to respond to it. For the remainder of that night, I didn't sleep. I drove to another parking lot, a Walmart that was roughly 10 miles distant, and waited for the sun to rise while keeping my door shut and holding my pepper spray in my lap. My heart raced with each passing van. I went into a panic attack whenever someone approached my car too closely. I made a call to the shelter Sergeant Kimmel had recommended. When daybreak eventually arrived, I accepted the bed that was available. I was able to accumulate money for a deposit on a small studio flat in Cleveland Heights during my 6 weeks there, long enough to secure a position at a call center that at least paid something, albeit not much more than minimum wage. I never returned to that. McDonald's. Though occasionally, I wonder if he found someone else. I never saw the man in the white van again. Someone who failed to wake up in time, whose doors were unlocked. More than anything else, that thought keeps me up at night. Recollection of his face outside my window. I was fortunate. Now I am aware of that, and I detest that. When you have nothing and nowhere to go, survival depends on luck. For around 3 days, running away from home felt liberating. After that, I was constantly afraid, chilly, and hungry. As a 17-year-old junior, I should have been thinking about prom dates and ESATs, but instead I was sleeping on a bench in Riverside Park with a group of guys who had been homeless for years. My parents and I had been, since my dad lost his job, we have been fighting non-stop. After a heated argument about my grades one evening, I simply grabbed a rucksack and headed out. I felt like I was saying something. I assumed they would search for me and plead with me to return. No one showed up. When I departed, I had $40 in my pocket, and I had nothing by the 4th day. When your stomach is devouring itself, pride is a foolish thing. The majority of the group I joined was benign. An elderly man was present. Because of his clothing, everyone referred to him as Patches. Additionally, Rita was a self-talking woman who always shared her food when she had it. Scotty was a younger man, perhaps in his mid-20s, with a nervous laugh and poor teeth. Carl came next. Carl was not like the others. The other homeless individuals seemed to steer clear of him, since he was quiet and reserved. He had a gray beard, was perhaps 50 years old, and had watery blue eyes that never seemed to focus. He guarded the items in his shopping basket as if they were precious. He also slept separate from everyone else, at the far end of our small camp. The others whispered that Carl was sitting on a little fortune, but was too insane to spend it, and that he had money stashed somewhere. I never thought that was true. However, I did observe that Carl was always eating snacks, granola bars, and occasionally even sandwiches. And on the fifth night, after going nearly 2 days without eating, I kept looking at his cart for days. I made my choice at around 2 in the morning. Everyone pretended to be asleep, with the exception of the occasional vehicle traveling on the road beyond the trees. The park was completely silent. I had been lying on my bench for hours, unable to fall asleep due to frequent discomfort in my stomach. I had never felt hunger like this before. It was no longer merely discomfort. It hurt. Actual suffering. I felt as though something was tearing at my insides. Carl was dozing off next to his cart in a filthy sleeping bag. It was only a candy bar, I assured myself. Only one candy bar. He had an abundance. He wouldn't even be aware. With my heart thumping so hard I could feel it in my throat, I gently stood up and slipped over to his cart. Near the top of one of his plastic bags, my hands discovered a Snickers bar. I returned to my bench after grabbing it. It took about 15 seconds to complete. I ate that candy bar in 3 bites, stuffing it into my mouth like an animal, without even trying to taste it. The following morning began as usual. People were slowly awakening, moving around, and Rita was folding her blankets while babbling her normal rubbish. The edge was off, and I felt almost relieved, even though I was still hungry. About 20 minutes passed during that period of relief. Carl awoke at that point and began searching his cart. I pretended to be preoccupied with my backpack as I observed him from across the camp. But I could see everything. He was examining his baggage and counting his belongings when he paused. His entire body stiffened. This time he checked more desperately, searching through the plastic bags and extracting items. Then he got up and used those teary eyes to survey the camp. I briefly believed that he was staring directly at me. My chest constricted, but his eyes passed me and settled on Scotty, who was the closest person to Carl's cart, sitting on a milk crate approximately 10 feet away. Scotty didn't know what was going on. He was sitting there, doing nothing but plucking at his fingernails. Carl approached Scotty at a steady, methodical manner that made my stomach turn. He came to a stop directly in front of him and stood staring down for a short while. "Hey man, what's up?" was what Scotty said as he looked up with that nervous smile of his that revealed his poor teeth. Carl remained silent. He simply inquired quietly about the location of his belongings. Scotty appeared perplexed. He claimed to have no idea what Carl was discussing. I could hear the hardness in Carl's voice as he asked again, louder this time. He claimed that Scotty was dozing off next to his cart when someone stole food from it. Shaking his head, Scotty declared that it wasn't him. He didn't take anything. That's not what he would do. Carl, however, was not paying attention. Now the other campers were beginning to pay notice. Patches got up from where he was observing the fountain. Rita halted her mumbling. I was sitting on my bench, paralyzed, with the taste of that Snickers bar still in my lips, while everyone else was staring at Carl and Scotty. I ought to have spoken up. Years later, I still tell myself that. I should have gotten up and acknowledged what I had done, but I was afraid and foolish at the age of 17. So I just sat there and watched it happen, like if it were on TV. Carl pulled Scotty off the milk crate by grabbing him by the front of his jacket. Scotty was weaker, thinner, and smaller than Carl. Carl had him good, despite his attempts to pull away. It was not him, he repeated. Please, he wasn't the one. However, Carl simply kept asking, more loudly each time, where his belongings were. Carl then delivered the opening blow. Scotty was hit squarely in the face, and when I closed my eyes at night, I could still hear this sound, a wet, smacking sound. Carl got on top of Scotty after he fell hard. The other homeless folks did nothing except observe. No one moved to assist. No one spoke. They were all afraid of Carl, I believe. Perhaps they simply didn't want to participate. In any case, both they and I just stood there. I have never been able to adequately explain what transpired next to anyone. For what seemed like an eternity, but was really only a few minutes, Carl defeated Scotty. He struck him in the stomach, ribs, and face. Scotty made an attempt. Carl curled into a ball on the ground in an attempt to hide, but he persisted. Scotty eventually ceased making noises. He gave up attempting to defend himself. Carl continued to strike him as he lay there with his arms dropped to his sides. More than anything else, the sounds are what I recall. The sound of fists hitting flesh was dull. Carl was breathing heavily, grunting with every stroke, and Scotty was making this awful gurgling sound, as if he were attempting to breathe through liquid. I wanted to run, yell, take action. However, my body refused to move. My feet felt as though they were nailed to the floor. Because I was hungry, self-centered, and too cowardly to speak up, I just stood there and watched a man be beaten nearly to death for stealing a candy bar. When Carl's energy ran gone, he eventually stopped. He stood over Scotty for a long time, staring down at what he had done, while panting and with blood on his knuckles. After spitting on him, he returned to his cart as if nothing had occurred. Scotty remained still. His face was crimson, bloated, and unrecognizable. Additionally, a dark pool was starting to form on the concrete beneath his head. Rita began to sob softly, her cries sounding more like hiccups. Patches said he was calling an ambulance and took out an ancient flip phone. Calm as ever, as if he had just completed some mild workout, Carl simply sat down beside his cart and began eating a granola bar. No one gave me a glance. The thin adolescent who had only been there for a few days was not suspected. Why would they do that? I was just a youngster on the run. The person who slept closest to Carl's cart was Scotty. The fact that it was him made sense, but it wasn't him. I was the one. Scotty was on the ground, possibly dying as a result of my actions. It took about 20 minutes for the ambulance to arrive. I sat on that bench for 20 minutes. I was staring at Scotty's corpse, waiting for him to do something that would indicate he was still alive. Like move or make a sound, he remained still. The blood continued to spread behind his head, and his chest was scarcely rising and falling. When the paramedics arrived, they spent a considerable amount of time tending to him before putting him on a stretcher. When one of them inquired about what had happened, Patches just replied that there had been a fight and a disagreement about stolen goods. I could see the condemnation in the paramedic's eyes as he surveyed all of us. These filthy homeless individuals gathered in a municipal park at 7 in the morning. He didn't inquire further. A little while later, the police arrived. Patches and Rita were questioned by 2 officers, but they didn't appear particularly interested in looking into the matter further. By then, Carl had already vanished, slipping off with his cart while everyone was concentrating on Scotty. I responded that I was asleep when it began, when one of the police inquired if I had seen anything. I told him a falsehood in front of him. After writing something in his small notebook, he turned to leave. A fight between homeless men in a park was unlikely to be thoroughly investigated. About an hour after the police departed, I fled the camp. I didn't bid anyone farewell. I simply picked up my rucksack and headed off. I just need to move. I have no idea where I'm going. Should leave the area on the concrete where Scotty's blood was still drying. I spent hours strolling about the city, passing stores, eateries, and everyday people going about their daily lives. And I continued to reflect on what I had done. Not only the theft, but also the fear and quiet. I had remained silent while witnessing an innocent guy be battered nearly to death. I had told the police a falsehood. There was nothing I could do about my horrible involvement. I could see Scotty's face every time I closed my eyes. Considering how it was maintained, as well as the gurgling sound he produced when his breathing stopped. Am I correct? Around lunchtime, I discovered a payphone. I have no idea why I stopped there. I was simply carried there by my feet, and before I realized it, I was calling my home number. My mother responded on the second ring. She didn't scream at me. That's what broke me. I anticipated yelling, rage, and everything else we had been hurling at one another for months. Rather, her voice broke, and she repeatedly stated my name as if she couldn't believe it was me. She inquired about my whereabouts, well-being, and injuries. My dad's question about who was on the phone could be heard in the background. When she told him it was me, I heard him make this sound. I had never heard him make this choking, frantic sound before. I informed them of where I was. I hardly recognized a few downtown intersections. My mother also mentioned that they were on their way to collect me. Simply remain there. Don't move. They were on their way. After hanging up, I dropped down on the curb and began to cry. I was sobbing loudly and uglily, causing passers-by to gawk at me. I wasn't crying quietly either. I sobbed for Scotty, who might have passed away by then. I sobbed for myself because I was so foolish and I had been self-centered. I sobbed because, despite everything, my parents continued to love me even though I didn't deserve it. About 40 minutes later, my dad's pickup arrived, and he didn't say anything when he got out and saw me sitting there on that curb, filthy, thin, and broken. He simply came up and gave me such a strong embrace that I felt like my ribs would break. I kept what actually transpired in that park a secret from them. Until today, I had never told anyone. I mentioned that I had been sleeping on the streets, that it was difficult, and that I wanted to go home. That was all accurate, but it wasn't the complete story. I returned to school, completed my junior year, and received my diploma the following spring. I attended a community college, found employment, and established a life that was quite typical. But Scotty was always on my mind. For months thereafter, I searched for updates on him, looked up any reports of a homeless person online. I never discovered anything, although I saw a man pummeling at Riverside Park. I have no idea if he survived or passed away. I'm not sure if Carl was ever apprehended. That ambiguity is a form of punishment in and of itself. I believe I still dream about it on certain nights. I'm back on that bench, watching Carl approach Scotty, and I'm about to admit that it was me. I left him alone after taking it, but he didn't make any noise. I just watch in silence while it repeats itself. I have not stolen anything since I turned 24. That morning. Not a pen, not a candy bar, nothing. It doesn't compensate for my actions. Nothing will ever do that. However, it's the only pledge I know how to retain. In Portland, Oregon, November may be harsh, and it came with a vengeance that year, cutting through all the layers you had put on. In 2009, my high school class graduated, and for the greater part of 3 years, I had been sleeping beneath bridges and in parking garages, while the majority of them were starting families and professions. I lost my job as a warehouse supervisor, and finally my flat due to a difficult divorce, a worsening drinking problem, and a number of decisions I still regret. I was quite well versed in the routine of street survival by the time that specific Friday night arrived. You discover where you fit in, which shelters have beds, and which are just problems. And, above all, you find your people. I was on my way to an abandoned lot off Burnside that night, where a bunch of us had been congregating for weeks. It was concealed from the main road by overgrown shrubs, a chain-link fence with a handy hole near the back corner, and a dilapidated brick structure that had once been a print shop. 5 other people were already gathered around a corroded oil barrel that Jerome had hauled there a month prior, when I managed to slip through that opening in the fence at around 8 o'clock in the evening. Jerome was a Vietnam veteran, most likely in his late 60s, with eyes that had witnessed too much of everything and a chest-length gray beard. He possessed a quiet authority that came from experience rather than intimidation, and he had a way of maintaining order in the company. A woman who was usually feeding the pigeons with any bread scraps she could find sat next to him and was known by everyone as Birdie. Tommy, a slender young man who could not have been more than 22, was likewise fleeing something he never discussed. Additionally, the Pratt brothers, Lenny and Gus, were left with nothing but debt after their mother passed away, leaving them homeless together. For blocks, the only source of warmth was the fire within the barrel, which we revered. It began like any other night. We shared a bottle of inexpensive whiskey that Gus had found somewhere, and Jerome shared a tale from his stay in Dang. As she went through a plastic bag filled with items she had gathered over the day, Birdie hummed to herself, small gems that meant nothing to anyone else, but everything to her. From the skip outside a grocery store on Hawthorne, I had made a respectable harvest. A couple of bruises, apples, 2 cans of beans that were dented but still unopened, and half a loaf of bread that was barely stale. Since that was how things operated between us, I shared what I had. You didn't ask questions or hold on to any debts. You gave when you could and took when you needed. Little sparks flew up into the pitch-black sky as the fire within the barrel crackled and burst. And it was almost serene for a second. Every time you exhaled, you could see your breath forming dense clouds because the temperature had dropped to about 30 degrees. Drawing as much warmth as we could from the fires and each other, we all remained around that barrel, our shoulders almost touching. Around 10:30, the troublemaker entered through that gap in the fence with a rucksack that appeared to be packed to the brim and a ripped army jacket. Everyone on the streets knew to avoid Ray Durkin, who went by that name. He was perhaps 45 years old, with a shaved head covered in shoddy tattoos and a scar extending from his left eyebrow to his chin. He had the build of a man who had served time and spent every minute of it in the prison yard. Rye's violent reputation was well deserved. I had saw him smash a man's arm over a place to sleep close to the Willamette River 2 winters ago, and occasionally I could still hear the sound of that bone breaking while I slept. Without even nodding to anyone, he entered our circle as if he owned it, dropped his backpack with a loud thud, and began warming his hands over our fire right once. Beside me, Jerome stiffened, and I saw Tommy slowly retreating into the darkness. Even Lenny, who was typically ready with a quip or a, uttered no words at all. No one spoke for a while. The fire crackled between us as we sat there in that uncomfortable silence. Ray was on the other side of the barrel, looking at each of us as if he were assessing potential victims. At last, Jerome broke the bow. by giving Ray a sip from the whiskey bottle, a peaceful gesture I had previously witnessed him do to ease stressful situations. I was able to bring about silence. Without saying anything, Rai grabbed it, swallowed 3 times, and then used the back of his hand to wipe his lips. He didn't return it. Rather, he placed it on the ground beside his backpack and began searching through his belongings, removing a dirty sleeping bag under a tarp that appeared it had been hauled through mud. I could hear Birdie's respiration quickening as she kept her head down and her fingers continued to fumble nervously in her plastic bag. I knew better than to set myself up as a target, but I still wanted to tell Rai that there were other places he could utilize. As I watched him settle in, like a thundercloud that had chosen to park itself smack in the heart of our small paradise, I sat there with my mouth clenched. About an hour later, the disagreement broke out, and it was like a surprise blow. As the evening went on, Gus became increasingly upset and whispered things to Lenny that I was unable to understand. Rai must have heard something at some point, because his face became as rigid as concrete, and his head turned towards the brothers. Despite the fury between them, he gently rose up, and I could sense his rage, radiating heat more intense than any flame. He asked Gus where his army jacket, which he was wearing, was, pointing a large finger at him. Gus mumbled that he had found it 3 weeks prior, and had taken it from a donation basket outside a church on Glisson Street. Rai, though, would not have it. He went over, took 4 swift steps around the barrel, grabbed Gus by the jacket collar, and lifted him halfway off the ground, as if he were weightless. That jacket was his, Rai gritted his teeth, saying that it had been taken from his camp 2 months prior, while he was incarcerated for assault. I couldn't tell whether it was real or not, but at that point, it didn't matter. When a violent man believes he has been mistreated, the truth rarely counts. Lenny made the completely incorrect decision as he leaped up to defend his sibling. In an attempt to release Rai's hold on Gus, he gave him a forceful shove to the chest. And it did work for a moment. Gus collapsed to the ground, moaning and clawing at his throat, while Rai staggered back a step. However, Ray's expression transformed into something I can only characterize as hollow. It was as if a switch had been flipped, turning off whatever humanity was behind those eyes. He threw punches that made wet, heavy sounds against flesh and bone as he charged towards Lenny with a ferocity that was horrifying to watch. Jerome attempted to step in, clutching Ray's arm from behind, but Rai turned and elbowed him in the temple, causing the elderly man to fall on the ground. Now Birdie was screaming, a high-pitched wail sound that seemed to reverberate off the surrounding brick walls. My legs would not move, even though I was standing, caught between the need to help and the need to survive. Tommy had already vanished through the fence's opening. Intelligent child. Though it was probably only 15 or 20 seconds of absolute commotion, the entire action played out in what felt like slow motion. That's when it took place. Lenny had ceased fighting back, but Ray was still hitting and had him pinned on the ground. Gus then attacked him from behind, while holding a chunk of shattered concrete that he had picked up from somewhere. He forcefully struck Ray's shoulder with it. It was only his shoulder, not his head, but it was enough for Rai to roll off his brother and yell in agony. With a furious expression on his face, Ray got to his feet and went towards the oil barrel. I assumed he was attempting to seize a weapon. Perhaps one of the pieces of waste wood we had been using to feed the fire, but instead he just violently shoved everything over, as if he planned to burn the entire world down if he lost the battle. With a terrible mechanical screech, the barrel toppled, and the embers and burning wood inside spilt out over the parched plants, and that lot's ground was covered in rubbish. We all stood motionless for a time, watching those tiny flames ignite and spread like living things in search of something to eat. The fire spread more quickly than I could have imagined. It was a wall of orange and yellow speeding across the lot towards the old print shop building, and then it was just a few spots of burning weeds. Everything had become kindling due to the dry fall. The grass is lifeless. The stacks of cardboard that served as our bedding, pallets made of wood, were piled up against the fence. Like it had been drenched in petrol, everything went up. I stumbled backward as a wave of heat hit me. Soon after, there was thick, black, and suffocating smoke. Somewhere to my left, I heard Bertie coughing, so I instinctively reached out, grabbed her arm, and began dragging her in the direction of the fence hole. With blood streaming down the side of his face from Rye's elbow, Jerome was already up, and he was demanding that the Pratt brothers relocate. Lenny, though, was immobile. Gus was attempting to pull him away from the flames, which were becoming closer by the moment. But he remained curled up on his side on the ground where Rye had left him. Like the coward that he was, Ray had disappeared into the night and smoke, leaving the rest of us to face with the horror he had conjured. I screamed at Bertie to go without turning around as I got her to the fence and virtually shoved her through the opening. I was unable to abandon the others, so I turned around and fled back into that hellish landscape. The heat was so intense that it seemed like a tangible weight on my skin, and the smoke was so dense that I could hardly see 3 feet ahead of me. Initially, I discovered Jerome wandering in the wrong direction, confused by the knock to his head. I took hold of his arm, gestured to the fence, and instructed him to follow the brick wall in order to locate the opening. I then went in search of Lenny and Gus. I discovered them in the middle of the lot, with flames around them on 3 sides. Lenny was sitting up thanks to Gus, but his expression was a mess of swelling and blood, and one of his eyes was fully closed. His left arm was obviously broken in at least one place, and hung at an angle that made my stomach turn. The fire had spread to an old tire pile close to the lot's edge, and the flames rising from there resembled something from a horror film. The stars above us were obscured by a plume of billowing black smoke. I was aware that our only means of escape would be cut off in about 30 seconds. Gus took the other side, and I grabbed Lenny's good arm and flung it over my shoulder. Together, we pulled and carried him in the direction of the fence. With each step, Lenny let out a scream. I still occasionally hear this untamed animal sound when the night is too silent. Now there was a real roar coming from the flames, like a huge beast breathing down our necks, and the heat was making the hair on my arms sing. We didn't have time to notice the tiny, stinging kisses that sparks left on our skin and clothes as they rained down on us like burning snow. We arrived at the gate just as the area where we had been standing moments earlier was consumed by flames. Lenny was the first person I pushed through the hole, and I did it as gently as I could, which was not at all gentle. Gus scurried through behind him. The last person out was me. Additionally, as I compressed, I could feel the metal, sheeted by the fire only a few feet away, against my palms through that opening in the chain link. On the opposite side, we fell onto the pavement. With smoke in our lungs and tears in our eyes, we were all coughing and gasping. The whole lot behind us was on fire, flames extending upward like fingers reaching towards the moon in the sky. I could hear sirens approaching from a distance. So someone must have phoned the fire department from one of the surrounding buildings. We all experienced a primitive reaction to the sound. With those bloodshot, weary eyes, Jerome gave me a slow shake of his head before hobbling out into the shadows between buildings. Birdie vanished as soon as she got past the barrier. Gus turned to face me after looking at his brother, and I could see the difficult decision on his face. The paramedics would assist Lenny if we stayed, but the cops would also arrive. Questions, warrants, and the system that had let us all down in many ways would engulf us once more. But with those injuries, Lenny might not survive the night if we ran. I decided on his behalf. I told Gus to leave with his brother and that I would stay, call for an ambulance, give them a false name, and claim to have found Lenny in this condition on the street. After a brief moment of hesitation, Gus nodded and began pulling Lenny away from the fire's intensifying glow. I rehearsed my lie while sitting on that chilly pavement and waiting for the red and blue lights to appear. As the adrenaline faded, all I could feel was fatigue and an overwhelming melancholy that made it difficult for me to breathe. About 5 minutes later, the paramedics discovered me sitting there, smelling like a chimney and covered in soot. I informed them precisely what I had intended, that I discovered an injured man on the pavement while passing by, that I was unaware of his fate. They didn't trust me. It was evident in their eyes. They didn't care enough to press, though. They had a fire to avoid and a patient to stabilize. The tale of a destitute man was the least of their worries. Soon later, the firefighters showed up. 3 trucks whose flashing lights illuminated the entire neighborhood, and they started tackling the fire that had now reached the former print shop. From across the street, I watched as they fought it for almost 2 hours before finally. Later on, I learned that Lenny had lived. Gus took him to a volunteer-run clinic on the east side, where they adequately bandaged him without asking any questions. He lost most of his left eye's vision, and his arm mended crookedly, but he survived. When I saw him lying in that burning lot, that was more than I had anticipated. Despite hearing rumors over the years, I never saw Ray Durkin again after that evening. Some claimed he was serving a 25-to-life sentence in California after being arrested on a 3rd strike offense. Others claimed that during a cold spell in Seattle, he froze to death beneath a flyover. Even though I am aware that it is a lie, I prefer to believe the second one, if I am being honest, because it feels like some sort of justice. A sinister thing to wish upon someone else. After the fire, the remainder of our little party dispersed. Jerome relocated to the south, claimed that the cold was becoming too severe for his bones. Birdie wound up in a women's shelter, and as far as I know, was accepted into a program for transitional housing. Tommy simply disappeared, as if he had never existed. I never saw him again. For me, that evening altered something inside my chest that had been closed for a very long time. 3 weeks later, I checked myself into a detox program, cleaned up, took a job cleaning dishes at a downtown restaurant, and gradually began to move back towards a life. Every time November arrives and the temperature drops to that specific level, I still think of that night. I consider how quickly everything can collapse, how one violent act might shatter the delicate peace that people construct when nothing else is available to them. And I consider Jerome giving Ray the bottle of whiskey in an attempt to maintain harmony, not being aware that some fires begin to burn long before the initial spark appears. I.P. You'll do things you said you would never do if you sleep under a bridge in March. At the time of that night, I had been homeless in Columbus, Ohio, for roughly 4 months. In order to survive, I had already broken most of my own rules by that point. Prior to living on the streets, I had roommates, worked at a warehouse, and made timely bill payments. Then, within a few weeks, everything collapsed. The warehouse closed. While I was still coughing up mucus in the waiting area of a free clinic, I contracted pneumonia, my roommates moved out, and my landlord began the eviction process. When I was 19, my mother passed away. And I didn't have a safety net, because I didn't know my father. I was too embarrassed to confess what had occurred to me to my high school pals, who were dispersed around several states and leading independent lives. You learn things quickly as a lady living on the streets. You learn to follow your instincts, to prevent specific locations after dark, to keep your sleeping location a secret from others. On a Thursday night, I ran into him outside a high street coffee shop. It was chilly, the type that causes your teeth to hurt and creeps into your bones. I had my back to the pavement while I sat there. Masonry wall, in the hopes that someone might drop some coin or buy me a hot drink. Without saying anything, he came out of the store with 2 mugs and offered me one. He was clean-shaven, medium-built, perhaps in his early 40s, and wearing an expensive-looking gray wool coat. Gary was his name, he said, and he occasionally worked as a volunteer at a downtown shelter. We had a typical conversation for around 10 minutes. The weather, the severity of the winter, and the need for the city to provide additional services for individuals such as me. He spoke in a serene, kind manner, akin to that of a priest or therapist. I wanted to turn him down when he offered me $50 and a warm place to spend the night without any conditions. Every instinct I had acquired while living on the streets advised me to decline. But he appeared so genuine, and I was freezing and fatigued. I assured myself that I could manage any situation. In ways that still give me nightmares. I was mistaken about that. The interior of his dark blue automobile was spotless and had a pine air freshener scent. He used his turn signals and drove cautiously, according to all speed limits. During the ride, we struck up a conversation, and he asked me about myself, my background, the length of time I had been homeless, and whether or not I had any family. He appeared to respect my ambiguous responses. He informed me that he had been divorced for a few years, lived alone, and worked in insurance claims. He exuded an air of ordinariness. It was a 20-minute journey into an unfamiliar residential region. There are many older homes with large yards that are set back from the road. He lived in a 2-story home at the end of a peaceful cul-de-sac. There are no neighbors around that may be shouted at. I was aware of that detail, but I ignored it. Before we could even exit the garage, after he parked into it, the door automatically closed behind us. The vehicle. That seemed a little odd to me at the time, but I convinced myself that wealthy people simply had different habits. The house was tidy inside, nearly too tidy. Everything had the appearance of something from a catalog. There is no dust, clutter, or personal images on the walls, and the furniture matches. He briefly showed me the living room, kitchen, and little bathroom on the first level. He said that the basement was off limits since he used it for storage and it was a mess, pointing to a hallway. I looked towards the door because of the casual yet authoritative way he said it. It was secured with a strong deadbolt, not the kind found on a cellar entrance, but rather on an outside door. Near the kitchen, I saw another door with the same kind of lock. He saw me staring and grinned. Claimed that since his divorce, he had been worried about break-ins. On the surface, that explanation made reasonable, but my chest constricted. Over the preceding few months, I had learnt to be aware of that emotion. It had kept me safe on multiple occasions. But now that I was inside, feeling warm for the first time in days, I told myself I was exaggerating. He offered me clean clothing and a shower, said that certain items left by his ex-wife might fit me. The upper bathroom was immaculate, fluffy towels, white tiles, and soap that looks costly. Before I undressed, I shut the door and double-checked the lock. I let the warmth seep into my muscles by staying under the spray longer than I should have, because the hot water felt amazing. When I emerged, I saw that the bathroom had slick plasterboard in place of a window. He left folded sweatpants, a long-sleeved shirt, and thick socks at the door. They had a fabric softener-like scent. He was heating soup on the stove in the kitchen when I returned downstairs after putting them on. He had arranged 2 bowls, 2 spoons, and napkins on the table, as if we were dining together as old friends. The soup was canned chicken noodles, not very fancy. I couldn't quite interpret the emotion on his face as he sat across from me and watched me eat. Nor impatient, nor hungry, just observing. He offered me more the moment I finished the bowl more quickly than I had intended. He showed me the guest room where I would be staying after dinner. There was only one bed, a dresser, and nothing else upstairs at the end of the hallway. Anything else, no decorations, no nightstand, and no lamp. Thick curtains were placed across the window. Additionally, I noticed metal bars on the exterior of the glass when I moved them back a little. Bars for security. In order to stop break-ins, nice individuals install in dangerous areas. However, every other house I had seen on the drive had regular windows, and this was not a nasty neighborhood. He shrugged when I asked him about it, said that they had to have been installed by the prior owners. Simply put, he had never bothered to take them off. He spoke calmly, yet his gaze lingered on my face for an excessive amount of time. I told him I wanted to go to bed since I was exhausted. With a nod, he bid me good night and shut the door. I tried the doorknob after waiting for his footsteps to fade down the hall. The door opened as it turned. I let out a breath. Perhaps I was simply being overly suspicious. I left my shoes on and lay down on the bed with the door slightly ajar. The next thing I remember is waking up to the sound of the door clicking shut, so I must have fallen asleep. I was unable to see anything because the room was utterly dark. I grabbed my phone of habit before realizing that I hadn't had a functional phone for some months. I listened while remaining motionless. There were slow, deliberate footsteps along the corridor, followed by quiet. As gently as possible, I slid off the bed and made my way to the door. Nothing happened when I grasped the handle and turned it. From the outside, the door was locked. I could feel my heart hammering in my throat. I gave it another go, pushing, tugging, and twisting the handle more forcefully. But nothing happened. I put my ear to the wood and heard steady, patient breathing coming from the other side, like if someone was waiting. I tripped into the dresser and knocked something on the floor as I retreated from the door. The breathing ceased, followed by footsteps once more as they moved down the hall. I trembled as I stood there in the dark, unsure of what to do. I located the window by feeling my way along the wall. I pulled the heavy curtains open to let in a small amount of outside light. Perhaps the moon or a street lamp. The window's bars were sturdy and bolted from the outside into the frame. Even though I knew it would be ineffective, I pushed against them. Slowly, my eyes adjusted, and I began looking about the room for useful objects. The dresser. Every drawer was empty. The bed was merely a mattress on the floor, with no frame. Nothing, not even a wardrobe. It resembled a cell, made to resemble a bedroom. I returned to the door, and took a closer look. The lock was a badger, basic latch mechanism that could be opened with a butter knife or a flathead screwdriver. I didn't have either, but I did have a metal zipper with teeth on my jacket. I removed the jacket and attempted to reach the latch by working the zipper pull into the space between the door and the frame. Fear made my fingers clumsy, but I persisted for what seemed like an hour, scraping and shoving. With a little click that seemed unbelievably loud in the quiet, the lock finally gave. I froze, expecting for him to run, waiting for footsteps. Nothing. I relax. I held my breath as the door opened, inch by inch. There was a slight brightness coming from downstairs, but the hallway was still dark. Perhaps a lamp or a television left on. As soon as I left the room, I spotted another door across the hall that I had missed during the quick tour. A desk covered with 4 or 5 monitors that displayed various views of the house. The guest room, the bathroom, the kitchen, and the garage was visible through the small opening. He had cameras all over the place. I noticed a fuzzy image of myself on one of the displays, standing motionless in the corridor, and I became aware that he might be observing me from any place in the house at the moment. I made myself get up and proceed in the direction of the stairs, avoiding any creaking floors by sticking close to the wall. It felt like a risk with every step. I reached the top of the stairs and peered down into the living room. Empty. It was about 30 feet to the front door. I heard his voice behind me halfway down the stairs, peaceful and somewhat amiable. He inquired where I was going and said my name, the fictitious name I had given him before. I didn't look back. I bolted. I ran for the front door, taking the steps 2 at a time and almost tripping at the bottom. After my palm struck the deadbolt, I twisted it, pulled the door open, and briefly enjoyed the cool night air on my face before his hand closed around my arm and dragged me back. Even though I knew there were no neighbors around to hear me, I let out a loud, unfiltered scream. He pulled me into the living room once more and flung me to the ground. His visage had entirely transformed, and he was considerably stronger than he appeared. That kind, worried look had vanished. It appeared as though he had turned off something inside of himself, since his eyes were empty and lifeless. He stood over me and told me that I shouldn't have done that, and that if I had just cooperated, things could have been simple. I did the only thing that came to mind when he reached down to grab me once more. I sank my teeth into the skin between his thumb and index finger till I tasted blood, biting his hand as hard as I could. In that instant, I rolled sideways and stood up as he shouted and jerked back. As he came towards me, I instinctively grabbed a lamp from an end table next to the couch and swung it at his head. He stumbled once the base made contact with his temple. He didn't collapse, but he stumbled enough to give me a few seconds. I dashed back to the front door, but for some reason he had locked it once more. The deadbolt rotated. The kitchen. I recalled the kitchen's back door. I ran. I managed to slow him down by knocking over a chair behind me as I made my way through the living room and into the kitchen. There was a chain lock, a deadbolt, and a standard lock on the back door. I heard him approaching, breathing heavily and swearing as his footsteps approached, and my fingers fumbled with all three. The chain arrived off. The deadbolt rotated. The standard lock made a click. I bolted into the backyard after flinging open the door. As I made my way towards the fence, at the property's edge, I could feel the chilly, damp grass beneath my feet. I struck the wooden, perhaps 6-foot-tall fence at full speed, clutching the top and hauling myself up. As I kicked back as hard as I could and felt my heel make contact with something solid, I felt a hand close around my ankle. Splinters dug into my palms as I hauled myself over the top as his hold relaxed, and I fell down the other side into an empty lot covered in shattered objects and dead plants. Glass, I continued. I ran across someone's driveway, through the lot, and down an unfamiliar street until my legs felt like they were about to give up and my lungs burned. About a mile distant, I came upon a petrol station with bright, friendly lights. I staggered inside, looking like a whole mess. I was crying, shivering, bleeding from my hands, and barefoot because I had misplaced my shoes. The cops were summoned by the woman working behind the counter. I told them everything. When they arrived at the residence, Gary had left. In a matter of hours, he had removed everything that could be used to identify him, including the monitors. The police promised to look into it, but it was clear from their expressions that they did not anticipate finding him. After that, I stayed in a shelter for 2 nights before purchasing a bus ticket to a different city. I never returned to Columbus. When you sleep outside after midnight, no one can tell you how silent the world becomes. People used to call me Eddie back when I worked as a plasterboard installer and lived in a studio apartment in Tucson. But my name is no longer important. Between my second back surgery and the opioid prescription that my insurance stopped paying for, that life came to an end. In the spring of 2024, I had been sleeping behind the Conover Road Recycling Center for about 8 months, and my 36th birthday had passed without any festivities. I was aware of all the city's shortcuts, rest areas, and establishments that would allow me to use their restrooms without any problems. I also knew which streets to stay away from after dark. And on the night everything changed, I entered that alley because of that understanding. I recall that it was a Wednesday, because the Fifth Avenue shelter offered hot soup on Wednesdays, and I had eaten for the first time in 2 days. Over the past year, things have become worse in the Ridley Heights neighborhood. 3 individuals had been shot there in the last month alone, and drug dealings were conducted openly on the corners. Usually, it took me 20 minutes to get to my sleeping area because I had to walk the entire distance. However, after trekking all day in search of aluminum cans to recycle, my legs hurt that evening. It felt like a fair compromise to use the alley behind the former textile mill. A straight shot that would cut through the perimeter of the risky area and keep me off the major thoroughfares. I had probably used it twice previously without any problems. The entry was situated between a closed pawn store and a former check-cashing establishment, both of which had rusting security gates and were covered in graffiti. At the far end, a single streetlight flickered, creating orange shadows against the brick walls that leaped and twitched. With only the sound of my own footsteps to accompany me, I tightened my jacket, adjusted the rucksack that contained everything I owned, and ventured into the darkness. The alley was longer than I remembered, perhaps 200 yards of fast-moving, brittle tarmac strewn with broken bottles. The left side was lined with dumpsters, full of trash that had not been picked up in weeks. I was about 30 feet in when the fragrance hit me. That foul mixture of rotting garbage and standing water collecting in improperly drained potholes. I walked purposefully, keeping my head down. Living on the streets taught you how to move. You should never appear disoriented or exposed. You should never appear to be an easy target. I came to a shopping cart, with its wheels stripped and rusted solid halfway through, pressed up against a chain-link fence. It was a type of monument, an indication that I had reached the halfway point, because someone had left it there months earlier. The alley and the vacant lot where the city had demolished an old warehouse 2 years prior were divided by that fence. They simply left it as a level area of weeds and concrete debris without constructing anything new. When I heard it, I was about 20 feet away from the shopping cart. I initially believed it to be an animal, perhaps a dog whimpering in the lot, or a cat in despair. The sound was distant and muted, originating on the opposite side of the barrier. I told myself it was none of my concern, and continued to walk at a slower pace. Curiosity gets you killed, beaten, or robbed in my world. You learn to keep your mouth shut and your gaze forward. However, the sound reappeared, this time stronger, and I knew it was a human voice. Someone is screaming. The sound was interrupted as if someone had covered their lips with a hand. I came to a standstill. Sweat started to appear on my brow, and my heart started to beat against my ribs. Every instinct told me to keep going, to pretend I heard nothing, to leave that alley and to never look back, even though the night air was chilly. However, my feet refused to comply. I moved stealthily in the direction of the fence, staying near the skips where the darkness was deepest. There were other holes in the chain link that had been ripped out by vandals or possibly by people like me who were trying to find a shortcut. I could look into the lot via one of these openings. The moon had appeared beyond the clouds, illuminating the cracked concrete and weeds with pale light. I initially only noticed the skeleton of the warehouse foundation and vacant space. Then, around 50 yards from where I was standing, I noticed movement close to the far corner. 2 numbers. No, 3, one on the floor. 2 were positioned above them. I narrowed my eyes in an attempt to comprehend what I was seeing. Drawing back his arm, one of the standing figures swung something down. The awful thump that followed was a heavy, wet sound that I had never heard before, but instantly recognized. After jerking, the figure on the ground became motionless. With a brief bark of laughter that reverberated around the deserted lot and reached my ears with horrifying clarity, the other standing figure laughed. My body responded before my brain could comprehend what I had seen. I made myself as small as possible by pressing myself flat against the skip. I saw the 2 men go away from the still figure on the ground through the opening in the fence. One was tall and heavy-set, dressed in a dark sweatshirt with elbow-length sleeves. The other had a shaved head that shone in the moonlight and was shorter and wiry. The tall one was carrying either a bat or a pipe. From that distance, I couldn't tell which. He cleaned his jeans with it, and I couldn't hear what he said to his partner. The shorter man nodded and took out his phone, the screen casting a spectral blue glow across his face. They appeared relaxed, carefree, and as though they had endless time, as if their recent actions were merely a small task. Since that last strike, the person on the ground had not moved, and I was very confident that I was staring at a corpse. I wanted to yell. I wanted to charge through the fence, take on those men, and find a way to save the person who was bleeding in the weeds. However, I'm not a hero. I am a 53-year-old man who is malnourished and has a terrible back. The only weapon I have is a dull pocket knife that I use to open cans. Without exerting any effort, those two would have killed me. The lot would then include 2 bodies rather than 1. I took the only action I could. I forced myself to breathe quietly and slowly, while resisting the want to gasp for air. While I waited for them to go, I mentally counted to 10, then 20. The tall one lit a cigarette, his thick beard and crooked nose momentarily illuminated by the glow from his lighter. Completely at ease, he took a long inhale and blasted smoke skyward. After completing his task on his phone, the shorter one put it back in his pocket. They continued to converse. After taking one last look at the body, he started to move towards the other end of the lot, where Dexter Street was accessible through a hole in the perimeter fence. I waited till they vanished into the far shadows. I was afraid that they may return or that one of them had somehow noticed me. So I waited for an additional minute, mentally calculating the seconds. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else when I eventually moved. With my gaze still locked on the black body that lay unmoving in the lot, I staggered backward away from the fence. A greater part of me saw that every second I spent there was a waste of time. But a smaller part of me wanted to see them, to see if they were still alive, so we could take action. Those men might come back at any time, or someone else might discover me close to a body and assume the worst. I was aware of how this operated. I was aware of who the police would arrest and who they would believe. A dirt-covered homeless man crouching close to a murder victim in the middle of the night. For a crime I did not commit, I would be imprisoned for the remainder of my life. Finding someone with a phone who could call the police and direct them to this precise location before it was too late was the only way to assist. I ran, if it wasn't already too late. It was a full-fledged, desperate sprint towards the end of the alley, instead of the deliberate, measured stroll I had learned to employ on the streets. With each step, my rucksack banged against my back. Years of smoking cigarettes and sleeping in chilly air caused my lungs to burn. I went out onto Fremont Boulevard and frantically scanned both sides for anyone. An open business, a car, and a pedestrian. There was nobody on the street. On both sides were shuttered shops with dark, metal-grated windows. Half a street ahead, I saw the gleam of fluorescent lights as I continued to run, my boots hammering against the pavement. A laundrette that is open around the clock for shift workers and those with insomnia. The small bell above the door almost tore from its mount when I slammed through it. A 60-year-old woman was sitting at one of the plastic tables inside, folding towels. Her hands were caught in midair as she gazed up at me, and I saw how I must have looked. A homeless man broke in like a crazy person in the middle of the night, wailing, perspiring, and struggling to breathe. I attempted to talk, but my words came out in bits and pieces. In the parking area behind the factory, someone was injured. Please call the cops. For what seemed like an age, the woman gazed at me. Her look wavered between bewilderment and terror. I was afraid she might yell, flee, or tell me to go. However, she must have been persuaded by something in my face, because she carefully dug into her purse and took out a cell phone. Her Maxine was her name. She had worked the night shift at a packaging company for 30 years before retiring, as I found out later. While I leaned against a washing machine and fought not to pass out, she used steady fingers to dial 911. I heard her repeat the description of the place. The dispatcher handed the phone to me after asking for explanation. The professional, composed voice on the other end asked questions that I found difficult to respond to. How many people are attacking? How did they appear? Did the victim continue to breathe? I told them everything I could recall. The short one with the shaved head, the tall one with the beard, the weapon that could have been a bat or a pipe. I informed them that the men had moved in the direction of Dexter Street. I urged them to go quickly. While we stood here conversing, someone was dying in that deserted lot, so please move quickly. 14 minutes after the call, the police showed up at the laundromat. I can tell because I kept an eye on the wall clock the entire time, and every minute seemed to drag on forever. While Maxine prepared instant coffee and styrofoam cups and distributed them as if we were at a party, 2 officers collected my statement. A somber meeting at midnight. In order to find discrepancies, they asked me the identical questions the dispatcher had asked before asking them again in different ways. I got it. As a witness, I had no identification, no address, and no proof that I was telling the truth. I was driven back to the lot by one of the officers in his patrol vehicle. The neighboring buildings were painted a vibrant red and blue by the additional cops that had already arrived. The opening in the fence was covered with yellow tape. Observing from the rear seat, paramedics came out of the parking lot with a stretcher. A white sheet covered the body on it. No one was hurrying. No one was shouting commands or administering CPR. They walked at the leisurely, languid pace of those who had come too late. I did not hear the cop next to me say anything, possibly in an effort to console me. The sound of that last strike, the damp thud that would reverberate in my skull for years to come, was all I could think of. 3 days later, they located the 2 men. A neighbor, a girlfriend, or perhaps simply someone who wanted the prize money that the victim's family had placed, had spoken. Carl Denning, 41, was the tall one's name. 3 previous assault convictions. The one that is shorter, Ricky Slade, his 26-year-old cousin, has been in and out of county jail since turning 18. James Okonkwo, a 23-year-old college student, was the victim. He had been walking home from his warehouse work, the wrong neighborhood, time, and location. Although it didn't feel like a difference, the cops told me that my description helped narrow down the suspects and that my willingness to come forward made a difference. James Okonkwo remained deceased. His body still needed to be identified by his mother. His companion, he still needed to be buried. I tried my best, but it was insufficient. And ever since, I have carried that burden every day. On certain nights, I still wake up in whatever shelter bed or doorway I found, gasping for breath and listening to the laugh reverberate through a deserted lot. I convince myself that I made the proper decision. I convince myself that I would have been killed if I had gone in there. In actuality, though, I'll never know if I could have saved him. I'll never know if 30 seconds of bravery could have made a difference. Everything. And the thing that haunts me more than those 2 is that ambiguity, that potential for permanence. My physique could have been altered by males. I was living at a women's shelter on the outskirts of town at the time, and I was making an effort to keep my days organized so I wouldn't spiral out of control. In the morning, I had to line up early, make sure my clothes were clean, and look for anything that paid money on the bulletin board. Weak coffee and the smell of disinfection clinging to everything I owned were the same way that day began. I left before dawn, in the direction of a day labor pickup location next to an abandoned petrol station, where contractors occasionally appeared. Hope had a way of having you stand there, even though you usually waited for hours and returned home empty-handed. I kept telling myself that all I needed to get back on my feet was a little respite. Bus passes, inexpensive motels, and rent deposits all seemed unattainable. That morning seemed unremarkable enough to be forgotten. I was unaware of how I would meticulously recall every detail in the future. A man parked across the street and observed the queue for some time without getting out while we waited. He appeared tidy, well-fed, and uncomfortable, in contrast to the others. A few minutes later, he approached and asked for assistance cleaning a house he was getting ready to sell. "It will only take a few hours," he remarked quietly, and offered money at the conclusion of the day. Just basic cleaning, no paperwork, no inquiries. When he spoke, he gave me a clear look as if he had already made up his mind. The others were already backing away or nodding their heads when I hesitated. The speed at which he identified me ought to have been more significant. Rather, I concentrated on the thought of having money by dusk. Before I gave myself time to change my mind, I consented. It wasn't a lengthy drive, but the scenery changed more quickly than I had anticipated. The road shrunk till it seemed forgotten. The houses dwindled, and the street lights vanished. He didn't say much, merely made brief remarks about the traffic and weather, as if we were co-workers. The house was by itself, next to a row of trees when we arrived, and there were no other houses nearby that could see us. The location appeared deserted, in a way that felt deliberate rather than deserted. There are no cars, no trash cans, and no window curtains. He motioned for me to enter first, after unlocking the door. The place didn't smell like it was being aggressively prepped for sale. Instead, it smelt stale, like dust and old wood. Trying to sound casual, I asked where the cleaning supplies were. At that point, he shut the door behind us without responding. I initially attempted to keep things light, since I thought there was a misunderstanding. I indicated I may go and return at a later time if this wasn't enjoyable. Without raising his voice, he moved between me and the door and said we should have a conversation first. He seemed to have practiced the move, as seen by the manner he blocked the exit. At that moment, I realized how silent the house was. There was no distant traffic, no appliance hum. There was only a blank bar at the top of the screen, and no service on my phone. He asked enquiries unrelated to work, and informed me that there was no cleaning job. With every response I gave, he appeared to get closer. At that moment, I understood that leaving calmly was not an option. Whatever this was, it was already heading in a path I couldn't afford to pursue. I made an effort to slow things down by chatting, posing irrelevant questions, and acting as though this was still a typical dialogue. He began to round the room, explaining how the house used to belong to family, and how no one came out this far anymore. My voice sounded more steady than I felt, like it belonged to someone braver. He was kept talking about how simple it was to forget someone, and how people vanished into routines. Every sentence fell with more weight than the previous one. Pretending to be looking for a lavatory, I edged towards a hallway in need of some alone time to reflect. He saw right away, and warned me not to stray. At that point, the anxiety became physical, rather than abstract. Putting pressure behind my ribcage, I realized that my inaction made things worse every minute. The corridor led to empty rooms with nothing on the walls and bare floors, as if the house had been purposefully stripped. From the outside, I saw that the windows were nailed shut. The timber was uneven and fractured. I was unable to open the metal lock on the back door from my side. He was observing me with the patience of someone waiting for a clock to run out when I came back to the main room. He assured me that nobody was in a rush and that I could take a seat. It was cruel to have a low battery alert buzzing on my phone. He nodded too soon when I begged to use the loo once more, seeming desperate this time. He trusted the house more than he needed to keep an eye on me, I realized as I turned to go. I spotted that opening first. The mirror in the washroom has a crack in the middle, dividing my face into two asymmetrical representations of myself. I looked around the room for anything helpful and locked the door. The window was tiny, but it was painted shut rather than sealed like the rest. I took hold of the towel rack and pulled until the screws came loose from the wall. His rapid footsteps followed the sound that reverberated throughout the home. Ignoring the sting of glass on my arm, I used the metal bar to smash the window. Sharp, genuine cold air surged in. He began yelling at me to stop and that I was making a mistake. I continued. Before he got to the door, I had already climbed halfway out. The fall outside was uncomfortable but manageable, and I hit the ground so forcefully that I lost my breath. I didn't turn around. Instinctively, my legs tore through the undergrowth and uneven ground in the direction of the road. I recalled my face being scraped by branches and my shoes being filled with filth. However, I persisted. A car halted as I got to the pavement, and the driver stared at me as if I were something out of a bad dream. Waving my arms, I fell upon the shoulder, my words coming out too quickly to be coherent. The driver waited with me till others came after calling for assistance. When officials visited the house later, they discovered it was empty once more, as if it had already made the decision to disappear. I continue to reflect on how close I was to becoming just another individual who went unnoticed. That evening, the shelter simply gave me a blanket and a cup of soup that shook in my hands and drove me back without asking any questions. I didn't get any sleep. Each time a person strolled, my body stiffened as I looked past my bunk, expecting to find him standing there as if he had been waiting. The following morning, I was seated in a small office with a caseworker who took notes while I spoke. It seemed surreal when I spoke it aloud, like I was talking about a movie I hardly remembered seeing. She informed me that I made the proper decision and that predators frequently sought for individuals who wouldn't be immediately noticed. More than anything else, the sentence stuck with me. Although it wasn't intended to harm, it did. An officer stopped by a few days later to inquire further. They tried to show me pictures of homes outside of town, to check whether any of them seemed familiar. Not one of them did. On paper, at least, the location I remembered didn't seem to exist anymore. He clarified that occasionally persons would temporarily occupy vacant buildings before anyone noticed. Without a precise location, there wasn't much they could do. My chest felt empty when I heard that. It indicated that he was still searching for another person. The officer advised me to stay near locations with staff and cameras and steer clear of day labor locations for a while. I took that advice seriously, even though it seemed insignificant in light of what had transpired. Eventually, a church program gave me a reliable job cleaning offices at night. There were people there and closed doors that opened from the inside, but it wasn't fancy. My body always responded before my thoughts did when a man stood too close or spoke too quietly. I discovered how to trust that response, without allowing it to take over. I began saving cautiously and slowly once more. I also struck up conversations with other ladies at the shelter, describing what transpired without going into specifics that would make them lose faith. I advised them to pay attention to the times when something felt off, even if it wasn't immediately apparent. I didn't realize how important such talks were. It's more about clarity than closure to post this now. I learned from that day how narrow the gap is between survival and extinction, particularly when one is already on the periphery. I have no idea what his intention was or how far it could have gone. Perhaps that's for the best. What I am aware of is that everything changed after I left. I currently live in a modest flat. It's nothing extraordinary, but the windows are open and the door locks. I still dream about that house sometimes, and when I wake up, I count the exits. On some nights, I stay asleep till the next morning, and I feel like I earned that triumph the hard way. Life at the time had reduced itself to what might fit in my rucksack and whatever goodwill the night had to offer. Most days blended together in a silent struggle to remain tidy enough to avoid attention, and sleeping occurred in bits and pieces, typically on benches or behind closed shop fronts. It had been colder than normal that night, the kind that seeps into your bones through thin fabric. On the outskirts of town, a petrol station shone like a tiny haven of security. Insects stuck to the glass, humming and buzzing under fluorescent lights. I went in, since I wanted a place to rinse my face and some water. There is nothing more ambitious than that. In the bathroom mirror, I scarcely looked like a person with a past, just a man with cracked lips and weary eyes. Even the lukewarm water I received from the sputtering wash basin felt like a treat. The outer world stopped pressing in for a few minutes. The loo had an odor that never really went away, like disinfectant coated over something older and nasty. I counted my breaths till the pain in my feet subsided as I leaned against the wall and let the silence envelop me. The only sound coming from the store speakers was the subtle music that permeated the walls. There was no clock inside. Somewhere near the front, the harsh clang of metal took the place of the music at one point. There was a loud thump that rattled the doorknob of the door, followed by another, heavier thud. Something was shouted, but the words were muffled by the steel and reverberation. I felt the resistance as soon as I pushed the handle out of instinct. The lock had moved, firmly and definitively, like a choice has already been taken. Not all of the panic came at once. It was embarrassing as it slowly seeped in. I knocked back, calling out that someone was inside while attempting to maintain a steady voice. The beating responded to me more quickly before ceasing completely. I could hear my own breathing echoing off the tile as the silence descended. The building felt empty, devoid of people and purpose, even though the light remained on. There was nothing that connected me to anyone outside of that room, not even a phone in my pocket or a bottle of water on the sink. Minutes grew into something heavier as time stretched in odd ways. Thirst replaced hunger, and my thoughts turned solely to thirst. Every sound from the street seemed far away, as though it came from an other reality. All I could hear for hours was the hum of the lights and the sharpness of my own thoughts. Perched on the floor, I became aware of how unnoticeable I had become, and how simple it was for someone like me to be locked up and forgotten. There wouldn't have been a name yelled out or a number dialed if something had happened inside. No matter who leaned against it or how long they remained silent, the door didn't care. The parched lips and the locked handle could never compare to the impact of that realization. When daybreak eventually arrived and when it opened, the clerk's expression changed from shocked to embarrassed to relieved. It's difficult to describe how I changed when I returned to daylight. I've been wondering about how close I actually am to disappearing ever since, and how nobody would have known if I had. I had to hide my eyes when the door opened, and light poured in like a weight. The clerk apologized repeatedly, claiming that they never checked the loo before closing, and that the latch must have accidentally caught. Since it was simpler to nod than to say anything, I did so. As I stood up, my legs felt weak, and my feet felt like they were no longer mine. I didn't care how it appeared. I asked for water, and drank it too quickly, pouring some down my chin. After a brief moment of staring, people returned to their daily activities, coffee cups, and lottery tickets. The darkness is already being swallowed by the morning. Nobody inquired as to how long I had been inside. Nobody inquired about my well-being. I went outside and sat on the curb, rounded by the chilly pavement. Cars came and went, doors slamming, engines starting. The typical rhythm at the start of the day. The location appeared innocuous from the outside. People forget it's just another petrol station as soon as they drive away. I couldn't stop thinking about the lock and how, without anyone noticing, a tiny turn of metal had wiped me from the building. The story would have turned out quite differently if I hadn't knocked and the clerk hadn't opened when they did. The idea remained heavy and painful in my chest. As I watched the sky lighten, I pondered how often this kind of occurrence occurs indefinitely. I attempted to act normally later that day, but everything seemed more acute. My throat reminded me of how frail the body truly is as my thirst returned swiftly. Suddenly, every locked door felt dangerous rather than protective. The pounding, the abrupt silence, and the way the air seemed stale after hours of stillness all replayed themselves in my mind. Fear was no longer the only thing. It was lucidity. Being homeless is more than just not having a place to sleep. It entails living on the periphery of other people's focus. When you lose focus, you are left to deal with whatever comes next on your own. I didn't search for enclosed areas that evening. I stayed in a place where doors couldn't determine my destiny, and where I could see the sky. I wasn't instantly changed by the event, but it did take something away from me. I realized how simple it would be for me to disappear into a forgotten corner of a building, a locked room, or a stairwell. I've been paying attention to sounds, exits, and just being noticed ever since. After that day, I changed, but the world didn't. Even now, if I walk by a petrol station late at night, I am reminded of how close I was to becoming an untold tale. The recollection kept coming back at odd times in the days that followed. My chest constricted as I washed my hands at a public wash basin. I was immediately drawn in when I heard a lock click close by. I found myself examining doors, hinges, and the way handles rested within their frames as if they were warning signs of impending disaster. It wasn't paranoia, so much as experience sharpened awareness. Every day, people would walk by me, near enough for me to smell their coffee or laundry soap. However, none of them were aware of my near overnight seclusion. I became aware of the fine line that separated being a part of the world from being forgotten within it. Eventually, I informed a man who had been out there longer than me about what had happened. He nodded and listened quietly. not at much shocked. His statement that buildings only perceive schedules and not individuals remained with me. Time of closure doesn't give a damn who is still inside. I was more troubled by that thought than by the barred door. Because systems aren't designed to recognize people like us. They function flawlessly. If you deviate from the expected flow, you are only an unreported error. As I stood there, I realized that the most terrifying aspect was not the dread or the thirst, but rather how typical the circumstances were. After that, I began making little adjustments. I didn't go somewhere unless I knew how many exits there were. If I entered a bathroom, I listened to footfall, jangling keys, and other sounds. To be sure someone had noticed me, I asked clerks questions I never would have asked before. It was uncomfortable and occasionally embarrassing. But suddenly, it seemed much worse to be unseen. I didn't want to be dependent on someone remembering to check a door. The hours I spent confined to that chamber changed the way I interacted with the outside world. Vigilant, but cautious. In the end, nothing dramatic came of it. No report, no letter of apologies, no impact that goes beyond what I can recall. For those like me, life continued as usual. One day, flowing into the subsequent one. However, I remember that night as evidence of how near disappearing actually is. Had I not raised my voice, if there wouldn't have been a story to share here at all, if the time had been a little different. This is what I'm sharing, since it occurred, because it might occur again, and because some people are merely as long as someone is aware of their presence. My life had reduced to a backpack, a prepaid phone, and any space I could claim covertly throughout the winter I'm referring to. Although I wasn't technically living on the streets, as people think, I wasn't stable either. I paid with cash, worked odd hours cleaning offices after they closed, and slept wherever I could be hidden and dry. My compromise with reality was that storage facility. It seemed like a loophole to rent a little flat. Something that was almost brilliant. A location with regulations, gates, and cameras that kept the majority of people away at night. It was only temporary, I assured myself, until I had enough money saved for a room elsewhere. It began like any other night. I relaxed more than I should have, because it was quiet, routine, and almost dull. The apartment I used had a concrete floor that retained the cold regardless of how many clothes I wore. And it smelt like dust and old cardboard. To ensure that nothing rattled or scraped as I shifted my weight, I placed my belongings with military precision. When the metal door was slightly lowered, a slit of air that was similar to breathing through gritted teeth. Before settling in, I always waited until the building was completely black, listening for the occasional clank of someone leaving late and the far-off buzz of traffic. The silence was more intense that night, as if the structure itself was holding its breath. The way the air felt against my ears made me imagine that it may rain. The silence broke in an unexpected way at some point after I lay down. Instead of the rushed pace of someone retrieving boxes before closing, slow, deliberate footsteps reverberated down the row. There was weight to every step, and the sound reverberated in an irregular pattern off the metal doors. Then there was the distinct sound of a nearby unit door lifting and a lock being changed. Unintentionally, I kept track of the seconds that passed between motions. Every sound was cataloged by my mind, as if it were proof. Whoever it was didn't rush, fumble, or mutter obscenities. I was more afraid of that than anything else. The above light abruptly turned on, sending a strong, white glare through the crack beneath my door and illuminating the hallway. My heart pounded so violently that I thought it made a sound of its own. Someone passed by, pausing now and again to test each lock, casting shadows over the concrete. I heard the delicate scrape of fingers on door handles and the little click of metal. My mind suddenly went in two different directions. Either remain motionless and hope to blend in with the structure, or take the chance of sliding out while I was hidden by the commotion. All of my instincts clashed, and all of a sudden, I felt as though there was not enough room for me to breathe. Pulling my jacket tighter, I leaned myself against the rear wall and tried not to concentrate too much about the sound of my breathing. The footsteps came to a stop just outside my flat, near enough for me to see the silhouette of shoes through the opening. After a longer than necessary interval, I heard my lock being tried with a gentle rattle. Although it didn't open, my chest ached at the sound of it being caressed. Whoever was out there moved close enough for me to smell the subtle scent of oil and a harsh, almost medical substance. At that moment, I became aware of how thin the metal door actually was, and how little kept me from being found. The individual proceeded, examining the subsequent unit after that. I moved my weight carefully, inch by inch, ensuring sure nothing touched the floor, following a pattern that felt deliberate rather than haphazard. My legs tingled from being too still, and despite the cold, sweat collected at the base of my neck. I saw glimpses of movement as the figure moved beneath each light through the breach. I could tell this wasn't casual by the way they paused, listened, and then carried on. This person was ensuring that everything was precisely as they had anticipated. A quiet voice drifted down the row, close enough to detect that someone else might be using a radio or on the phone, but not loud enough to hear words. Everything was altered by that. The thought of more than one person made the air feel heavy. Even yet one person was terrifying. I considered the distance to the far end of the exit and the sound of the gravel beneath my feet. To remain undetected, I had to have faith that no one had previously noticed me. Gambling that speed would outpace attention, leaving meant going out into the open in full daylight. I carefully raised the door an additional inch to have a clear view of the hallway as the footsteps got farther away. A figure appeared at the far end as the lights hummed overhead. Stood close to the office, comparing something to a list while holding a clipboard. As they passed one another, a second individual appeared from between units, nodding. I made my decision at that point. I waited until they had both looked away before slipping out and shutting the door as quietly as I could. No one called out, yet every step towards the exit seemed to reverberate. With my hands numb, my lungs burning, and everything I owned on my back, I didn't stop moving until I was past the fence. At first, I only went far enough to put some distance between that structure and myself. With my knees drawn in, I sat behind a line of dumpsters across the street and observed the building from the shadows. One of them was walking the perimeter fence with a torch, sweeping the beam along the ground and the gate while the light remained on longer than usual. It hesitated where I had just slipped through, then continued. I learnt what I needed to know from that pause. I doubt that I would have stayed inside and delayed even a bit longer. I have left by myself. I didn't move till the lights eventually went out once more. My shoulders hurt more from stress than from the cold, and my hands were rigid. I drove farther away from the area, staying on side streets and keeping an ear out for any slowing cars or shifting footfall. I felt like my body was still imprisoned in that small space, and every sound was exaggerated. That night, I slept very little. I simply continued to walk, pausing only when I kept repeating the series of noises in my thoughts until my legs felt like they may collapse. I returned during regular business hours the following day, attempting to appear like a typical patron with a purpose for being there. I hurriedly packed my belongings without making eye contact, half expecting to be stopped or questioned. Nobody did. The clerk in the office hardly looked up. Normally, that was unnerving in its own way. I let go of the entered the slot, turned to go, and didn't turn around. I didn't tell myself I was overreacting or fight with myself about it. After everything I'd seen and heard, I knew better. I never again slept in a storage unit. Soon later, I discovered an alternative arrangement that did not depend on being invisible. Even now, my body responds before my thoughts when I hear locks clicking into place or metal doors rolling up. I have no idea who those individuals were or what would have happened if I had remained undetected until they got to my door. What I do know is that I nearly lost the only thing I had left, the opportunity to leave, because I trusted that location to keep me safe.